Section 1 of Italian Hours by Henry James. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Venice. It is a great pleasure to write the word, but I'm not sure it is not a certain impudence in pretending to add anything to it. Venice has been painted and described many thousands of times, and of all the cities in the world it is the easiest to visit without going there. Open the first book and you will find a rhapsody about it. Step into the first picture dealers and you will find 3 or 4 high-coloured views of it. There is notoriously nothing more to be said on the subject. Everyone has been there, and everyone has brought back a collection of photographs. There is as little mystery about the Grand Canal as about our local thoroughfare, and the name of St. Mark is as familiar as the postman's ring. It is not forbidden, however, to speak of familiar things, and I hold that for the true Venice lover, Venice is always in order. There is nothing new to be said about her, certainly, but the old is better than any novelty. It will be a sad day indeed when there should be something new to say. I write these lines with the full consciousness of having no information whatever to offer. I do not pretend to enlighten the reader. I pretend only to give a fillip to his memory, and I hold any writer sufficiently justified who is himself in love with his theme. 1. Mr. Ruskin has given it up. That is very true, but only after extracting half a lifetime of pleasure and an immeasurable quantity of fame from it. We all may do the same after it has served our turn, which it probably will not cease to do for many a year to come. Meantime, it is Mr. Ruskin who, beyond anyone, helps us to enjoy it. He has indeed lately produced several aids to depression in the shape of certain ill humorous pamphlets, the series of St. Mark's Rest, which embody his latest reflections on the subject of our city and describe the latest atrocities perpetrated there. These latter are numerous and deeply to be deplored, but to admit that they have spoiled Venice would be to admit that Venice may be spoiled, and admission pregnant, as it seems to us, with disloyalty. Fortunately, one reacts against the Ruskinian contagion, and 1 hour of the lagoon is worth 100 pages of demoralized prose. This queer late-coming prose of Mr. Ruskin, including the revised and condensed issue of The Stones of Venice, only 1 little volume of which has been published, or perhaps ever will be, is all to be read, though much of it appears addressed to children of a tender age. It is pitched in the nursery key, and might be supposed to emanate from an angry governess. It is, however, all suggestive, and much of it is delightfully just. There is an inconceivable want of form in it. The author has spent his life in laying down the principles of form and scolding people for departing from them, but it throbs and flashes with the love of his subject, a love disconcerted and abjured, but which has still much of the force of inspiration. Among the many strange things that have befallen Venice, she has had the good fortune to become the object of passion to a man of splendid genius who has made her his own, and in doing so has made her the world's. There is no better reading at Venice, therefore, as I say, than Ruskin, for every true Venice lover can separate the wheat from the chaff. The narrow theological spirit, the moralism à tout propos, the queer provincialities and pruderies are mere wild weeds in a mountain of flowers. One may doubtless be very happy in Venice without reading at all, without criticising or analysing or thinking a strenuous thought. It is a city in which I suspect there is very little strenuous thinking, and yet it is a city in which there must be almost as much happiness as misery. The misery of Venice stands there for all the world to see. It is part of the spectacle. A thoroughgoing devotee of local colour might consistently say it is part of the pleasure. The Venetian people have little to call their own, little more than the bare privilege of leading their lives in the most beautiful of towns. Their habitations are decayed, their taxes heavy, their pockets light, their opportunities few. One receives an impression, however, that life presents itself to them with attractions not accounted for in this meagre train of advantages, and that they are on better terms with it than many people who have made a better bargain. They lie in the sunshine, they dabble in the sea, they wear bright rags, they fall into attitudes and harmonies, they assist at an eternal conversazione. It is not easy to say that one would have them other than they are, and it certainly would make an immense difference should they be better fed. The number of persons in Venice who evidently never have enough to eat is painfully large, but it would be more painful if we did not equally perceive that the rich Venetian temperament may bloom upon a dog's allowance. Nature has been kind to it, and sunshine and leisure and conversation and beautiful views form the greater part of its sustenance. It takes a great deal to make a successful American, but to make a happy Venetian takes only a handful of quick sensibility. The Italian people have at once the good and the evil fortune to be conscious of few wants, so that if the civilization of a society is measured by the number of its needs, as seems to be the common opinion today, it is to be feared that the children of the lagoon would make but a poor figure in a set of comparative tables. Not their misery, doubtless, but the way they elude their misery is what pleases the sentimental tourist, who is gratified by the sight of a beautiful race that lives by the aid of its imagination. The way to enjoy Venice is to follow the example of these people and make the most of simple pleasures. Almost all the pleasures of the place are simple. This may be maintained even under the imputation of ingenious paradox. There is no simpler pleasure than looking at a fine Titian, unless it be looking at a fine Tintoret or strolling into St. Mark's. Abominable the way one falls into the habit, and resting one's light wearied eyes upon the windowless gloom, or then floating in a gondola, or then hanging over a balcony, or then taking one's coffee at Florian's. It is of such superficial pastimes that a Venetian day is composed, and the pleasure of the matter is in the emotions to which they minister. These are fortunately of the finest. Otherwise Venice would be insufferably dull. Reading Ruskin is good. Reading the old records is perhaps better. But the best thing of all is simply staying on. The only way to care for Venice as she deserves it is to give her a chance to touch you often, to linger and remain and return. 2. The danger is that you will not linger enough, a danger of which the author of these lines had known something. It is possible to dislike Venice and to entertain the sentiment in a responsible and intelligent manner. There are travellers who think the place odious, and those who are not of this opinion often find themselves wishing that the others were only more numerous. The sentimental tourist's sole quarrel with his Venice is that he has too many competitors there. He likes to be alone, to be original, to have, to himself at least, the air of making discoveries. The Venice of today is a vast museum with a little wicket that admits you is perpetually turning and creaking, and you march through the institution with a herd of fellow gazers. There is nothing left to discover or describe, and originality of attitude is completely impossible. This is often very annoying. You can only turn your back on your impertinent playfellow and curse his want of delicacy. But this is not the fault of Venice. It is the fault of the rest of the world. The fault of Venice is that, though she is easy to admire, she is not so easy to live with, as you count living in other places. After you have stayed a week and the bloom of novelty has rubbed off, you wonder if you can accommodate yourself to the peculiar conditions. Your old habits become impracticable, and you find yourself obliged to form new ones of an undesirable and unprofitable character. You are tired of your gondola, or you think you are, and you have seen all the principal pictures and heard the names of the palaces announced a dozen times by your gondolier, who brings them out almost as impressively as if he were an English butler bawling titles into a drawing-room. You have walked several hundred times round the piazza and bought several bushels of photographs. You have visited the antiquity mongers whose horrible signboards dishonour some of the grandest vistas in the Grand Canal. You have tried the opera and found it very bad. You have bathed at the Lido and found the water flat. You have begun to have a shipboard feeling, to regard the piazza as an enormous saloon, and the Riva degli Schiavoni as a promenade deck. You are obstructed and encaged. Your desire for space is unsatisfied. You miss your usual exercise. You try to take a walk and you fail. And meantime, as I say, you have come to regard your gondola as a sort of magnified baby's cradle. You have no desire to be rocked to sleep, though you are sufficiently kept awake by the irritation produced as you gaze across the shallow lagoon, by the attitude of the perpetual gondolier, with his turned-out toes, his protruded chin, his absurdly unscientific stroke. The canals have a horrible smell, and the everlasting piazza, where you have looked repeatedly at every article in every shop window and found them all rubbish, where the young Venetians who sell bead bracelets and panoramas are perpetually thrusting their wares at you, where the same tightly buttoned officers are forever sucking the same black weeds at the same empty tables in front of the same cafes. The piazza, as I say, has resolved itself into a magnificent treadmill. This is the state of mind of those shallow inquirers who find Venice all very well for a week, and if in such a state of mind you take your departure, you act with fatal rashness. The loss is your own, moreover. It is not, with all deference to your personal attractions, that of your companions who remain behind. For though there are some disagreeable things in Venice, there is nothing so disagreeable as the visitors. The conditions are peculiar, but your intolerance of them evaporates before it has had time to become a prejudice. When you have called for the bill to go, pay it and remain, and you will find on the morrow that you are deeply attached to Venice. It is by living there from day to day that you feel the fullness of her charm, that you invite her exquisite influence to sink into your spirit. The creature varies like a nervous woman whom you know only when you know all the aspects of her beauty. She has high spirits or low, she is pale or red, grey or pink, cold or warm, fresh or wan, according to the weather or the hour. She is always interesting and almost always sad. But she has 1,000 occasional graces and is always liable to happy accidents. You become extraordinarily fond of these things. You count upon them. They make part of your life. Tenderly fond you become. There is something indefinable in those depths of personal acquaintance that gradually establish themselves. The place seems to personify itself, to become human and sentient and conscious of your affection. You desire to embrace it, to caress it, to possess it. And finally a soft sense of possession grows up, and your visit becomes a perpetual love affair. It is very true that if you go as the author of these lines on a certain occasion went about the middle of March, a certain amount of disappointment is possible. He had paid no visit for several years, and in the interval the beautiful and helpless city had suffered an increase of injury. The barbarians are in full possession, and you tremble for what they may do. You are reminded from the moment of your arrival that Venice scarcely exists any more as a city at all, that she exists only as a battered peep-show and bazaar. There was a horde of savage Germans encamped in the piazza, and they filled the ducal palace and the academy with their uproar. The English and Americans came a little later. They came in good time with a great many French, who were discreet enough to make very long repasts at the Café Quadri, during which they were out of the way. The months of April and May of the year 1881 were not, as a general thing, a favourable season for visiting the ducal palace and the academy. The valet de place had marked them for his own and held triumphant possession of them. He celebrates his triumphs in a terrible brassy voice which resounds all over the place, and has, whatever language he be speaking, the accent of some other idiom. During all the spring months in Venice these gentry abound in the great resorts, and they lead the helpless captives through churches and galleries in dense, irresponsible groups. They infest the piazza. They pursue you along the Riva. They hang about the bridges and the doors of the cafes. In saying just now that I was disappointed at first, I had chiefly in mind the impression that assails me today in the whole precinct of St. Mark's. The condition of this ancient sanctuary is surely a great scandal. The pedlars and commissioners ply their trade, often a very unclean one, at the very door of the temple. They follow you across the threshold into the sacred dusk, and pull your sleeve and hiss into your ear, scuffling each other for customers. There is a great deal of dishonour about St. Mark's altogether, and if Venice, as I say, has become a great bazaar, this exquisite edifice is now the biggest booth. 3. It is treated as a booth in all ways, and if it had not somehow a great spirit of solemnity within it, the traveller would soon have little warrant for regarding it as a religious affair. The restoration of the outer walls, which has lately been so much attacked and defended, is certainly a great shock. Of the necessity of the work only an expert is, I suppose, in a position to judge, but there is no doubt that, if a necessity it be, it is one that is deeply to be regretted. To no more distressing necessity have people of taste lately had to resign themselves. Wherever the hand of the restorer has been laid, all semblance of beauty has vanished, which is a sad fact, considering the external loveliness of St. Mark's has been for ages less impressive only than that of its still comparatively uninjured interior. I know not what is the measure of necessity in such a case, and it appears indeed to be a very delicate question. Today, at any rate, that admirable harmony of faded mosaic and marble which to the eye of the traveller are emerging from the narrow streets that lead to the piazza, filled all the further end of it with a sort of dazzling silver presence. Today this lovely vision is in a way to be completely reformed, and indeed well nigh abolished. The old softness and mellowness of colour, the work of the quiet centuries and of the breath of the salt sea, is giving way to large crude patches of new material which have the effect of a monstrous malady rather than that of a restoration to health. They look like blotches of red and white paint, and dishonourable smears of chalk on the cheeks of a noble matron. The face towards the Piazzetta is an especial and newest looking thing conceivable, as new as a new pair of boots or as the morning's paper. We do not profess, however, to undertake a scientific quarrel with these changes. We admit that our complaint is a purely sentimental one. The march of industry in united Italy must doubtless be looked at as a whole, and one must endeavour to believe that it is through innumerable lapses of taste that this deeply interesting country is groping her way to her place among the nations. For the present, it is not to be denied, certain odd phases of the process are more visible than the result, to arrive at which it seems necessary that, as she was of old a passionate votary of the beautiful, she should today burn everything that she has adored. It is doubtless too soon to judge her, and there are moments when one is willing to forgive her even the restoration of St. Mark's. Inside as well, there has been a considerable attempt to make the place more tidy, but the general effect as yet has not seriously suffered. What I chiefly remember is a straightening out of that dark and rugged old pavement, those deep undulations of primitive mosaic in which the fond spectator was thought to perceive an intended resemblance to the waves of the ocean. Whether intended or not, the analogy was an image the more in a treasure house of images. But from a considerable portion of the church it has now disappeared. Throughout the greater part, indeed, the pavement remains as recent generations have known it, dark, rich, cracked, uneven, spotted with porphyry and time-blackened malachite, polished by the knees of innumerable worshippers. But in other large stretches the idea imitated by the restorers is that of the ocean in a dead calm, and the model they have taken the floor of a London clubhouse or of a New York hotel. I think no Venetian, and scarcely any Italian, cares much for such differences, and when a year ago people in England were writing to the Times about the whole business and holding meetings to protest against it, the dear children of the lagoon, so far as they heard or heeded the rumour, thought them partly busybodies and partly asses. Busybodies they doubtless were, but they took a good deal of disinterested trouble. It never occurs to the Venetian mind of today that such trouble may be worth taking. The Venetian mind vainly endeavours to conceive a state of existence in which personal questions are so insipid that people have to look for grievances in the wrongs of brick and marble. I must not, however, speak of St. Mark's as if I had the pretension of giving a description of it, or as if the reader desired one. The reader has been too well served already. It is surely the best described building in the world. Open the stones of Venice, open Théophile Gautier's Italia, and you will see. These writers take it very seriously, and it is only because there is another way of taking it that I venture to speak of it, the way that offers itself after you've been in Venice a couple of months, and the light is hot in the great square, and you pass in under the pictured porticos with a feeling of habit and friendliness, and a desire for something cool and dark. There are moments, after all, when the church is comparatively quiet and empty, and when you may sit there with an easy consciousness of its beauty. From the moment, of course, that you go into any Italian church for any purpose but to say your prayers or look at the ladies, you rank yourself among the trooping barbarians I just spoke of. You treat the place as an orifice in the peep show. Still, it is almost a spiritual function, or at the worst an amorous one, to feed one's eyes on the molten colour that drops from the hollow vaults and thickens the air with its richness. It is also quiet and sad and faded, and yet also brilliant and living. The strange figures in the mosaic pictures, bending with the curve of niche and vault, stare down through the glowing dimness. The burnished gold that stands behind them catches the light on its little uneven cubes. St. Mark's owes nothing of its character to the beauty of proportion or perspective. There is nothing grandly balanced or far-arching. There are no long lines, nor triumphs of the perpendicular. The church arches, indeed, but arches like a dusky cavern. Beauty of surface, of tone, of detail, of things near enough to touch and kneel upon and lean against. It is from this the effect proceeds. In this sort of beauty the place is incredibly rich, and you may go there every day and find afresh some lurking pictorial nook. It is a treasury of bits, as the painters say. And there are usually 3 or 4 of the fraternity with their easels set up in uncertain equilibrium on the undulating floor. It is not easy to catch the real complexion of St. Mark's, and these laudable attempts at portraiture are apt to look either lurid or livid. But if you cannot paint the old loose-looking marble slabs, the great panels of basalt and jasper, the crucifixes of which the lonely anguish looks deeper in the vertical light, the tabernacles whose open doors disclose a dark Byzantine image spotted with dull crooked gems, if you cannot paint these things, you can at least grow fond of them. You grow fond even of the old benches of red marble, partly worn away by the breeches of many generations, and attached to the base of those wide pilasters, of which the precious plating, delightful in its faded brownness with a faint grey bloom on it, bulges and yawns a little with honourable age.